So with that said, please let's hear what you think about
Mm.
the migration crisis in Europe and to what degree recent events in France may impact that.
Well, the it's a huge issue, which is impossible to do justice to.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but I should say that you wrote what appeared to me to be a very courageous article in Standpoint, I believe. And
Mm.
our listeners should look that up. And in fact, I'll put a link to that on my blog where this podcast will be embedded. And this was an
Okay.
article I think you wrote. It was at least a month ago when the migration
Yes, 2 or 3
crisis.
months ago.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, very
Yeah.
early on when to worry out loud about this had to have been tantamount to some expression of bigotry for most people on the left. So it struck me as very brave and very balanced and very early to be making these noises. And so
Mm.
people should read that article. But now, please
Well,
tell
it's
us.
very kind. I My view is now what it was then. I've been to the points of entry in southern Europe, Italy, elsewhere, where migrants are coming, and there's a huge number of misunderstandings. The migrant crisis is not new, it's been going on for years. It's been at a high point this year, but it's also not a Syrian problem. It is in part a Syrian problem, but the Syrian component of the migration crisis is a minority part. The percentages differ, obviously, depending on which point of entry you go to. But we're not talking about more than 20, 30, some people have said at some points 40% of the migrants being from Syria. Most of the migrants come from elsewhere in the world, predominantly sub Saharan Africa, Eritrea, other places. So there's a great misreading of what this is. And when people say, oh, well, we could sort out the situation in Syria and that would stop the migration crisis, they're flat out wrong. You could sort out the situation in Syria. I don't actually, incidentally, think we can. You could sort out, though, pretend to sort out the situation in Syria. What's your plan for Eritrea? Can you even point to it on a
Hmm.
map? Most people have no idea what you're talking about when you talk about these countries. They simply say, well, Europe must take in the refugees or so. So the second point is this is very largely and in the main not an asylum issue. It is not a refugee issue. It is an economic migrant issue. That is why the majority of the people coming, the vast majority, are young men. Now, I have no problem with those people. I have no contempt or dislike for those people. They are people leaving societies that are not as privileged as mine is. But I do not believe that the response to that is that my society owes everyone in the world who wants a better standard of living a home in my country. I don't believe it. And I think it's dishonest and disreputable to pretend that you do believe it. If people want to take in refugees into their homes, they should do. I admire those people. I admire people who exercise generosity. I have, however, unending contempt for people who expect other people to be generous on their behalf. And what we are seeing are people parading their sentiments over an issue that is far beyond simple sentiments.
Hmm.
What is happening in the migration crisis is a vast and unparalleled migration of people. Germany is saying officially it'll take in an extra 1% of its population this year and an extra 1% the next year after and the years after that.
That's 800,000 people a year. Yeah. Yeah.
800,000 a year
Yeah.
with an 80 million population. Sweden is taking in the same proportion. Sweden is collapsing under this strain. The government's talking about having to put up taxes to pay for the migrants. They've run out of houses. They're having to put migrants in tents just as the Swedish winter comes along. The far right party in Sweden is now at the top of the polls, and so on. And you see this everywhere in Europe. Europe cannot be the answer to the world's problems. I think myself that there is a way to solve this that is far more desirable. If it is Syria you're concentrating on, help Syrians who are genuinely fleeing from the Syrian civil war to stay in countries around Syria, in the Lebanon, in Turkey, in any other country. It is always more desirable that refugees remain in the proximity of the country they're fleeing than that you ship them to Norway
Hmm.
or cart them off to Scotland. It makes no sense to do that. And another point, European leaders all said 5 and 4 years ago that multiculturalism in Europe had failed. Angela Merkel said it 5 years ago. President Sarkozy said it 4 years ago, and so did Prime Minister Cameron. What did they mean? I think what they meant was that people were living parallel lives in our societies, and that our societies were no longer, if they ever had been in recent decades, successfully integrated, that we had reverse assimilation going on and so on. Why on earth, if multiculturalism had failed when migration was at a relatively low point, would it not fail when it was at a historic high?
Mm.
I think that the answer to this is that the politicians in Europe have been trying to follow public opinion, but the public don't know what we want. We want contradictory things. Only 7% of the British public in a recent poll said they want more migration into Britain. 7%.
Mm.
It's a deeply minority view. And yet, the body of a young Syrian boy tragically washes up on the shores of Turkey. And Europeans are persuaded that the dead Syrian boy on the shores of Turkey is Europe's problem. Is Europe's problem. And so the European public say refugees welcome, or at least a proportion of them do, a minority do. I've always said that this was going to have a next turn of the wheel. The European publics do not want more migration anywhere in Europe. The next turn of the wheel last summer was the dead Syrian boy's body tragically washing up on the Turkish beach. And that caused a slight change in public opinion. But the next turn of the wheel, which I had been predicting for months, was what happened when the first refugee was involved in a terrorist incident. That's now happened. And I would predict that people who oversaw this insane policy are going to have a political Götterdämmerung at some point. Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, which tried to force quotas on European states earlier this year and force those quotas of migrants onto states at the same time that the European Commission said the numbers were not adequate, nowhere near adequate. Jean-Claude Juncker went on television last night and said that he did not like some of the talk of his critics about the immigration, and he asked them not to keep talking and invited the critics of the migration policy of Europe to, quote, be serious. Well, I would argue it was the critics of the immigration policy who were the only ones who were serious. It was us who was saying, if you take people in who do not come with passports or papers, what is your system for working out who they are, what they believe, and what they're going to do once they're here? There was no system. There is no system. If a politician wants to say to the European public, for every 100,000 people who come into Europe, maybe only 20 are jihadists. The European public can then work out 20 people, that's twice as many people as seemed to be involved in Paris the other day. Maybe that means we only need to lose 400 people in terrorist shootouts every few months or something for the benefit of getting 100,000 people from the third world. I don't think we're going to buy that. I don't think we're going to put up with it. The politicians are currently fighting for their political lives, and they will throw anything into the mix to survive.
Well,
but it is a horrible thing to witness.
What's so strange about this, I don't know if you saw this article in the New York Times, I think it was last week, talking about a village in Germany that has only 100 full-time residents that was being asked to absorb 700 to 1,000 migrants. And
yeah, so, absolutely.
So those,
absolutely. Let me give you another quick example. Malmo in Sweden, which has been famous in recent years for becoming effectively a no-go zone in places for its Jews. There are only just under 1,000 Jews now in Malmo in Sweden. Used to have a thriving Jewish population. They've been chased out largely by increasing Muslim population in the area and some very, very violent and unpleasant things that have happened to the Jews of Malmo. In Malmo, the remaining Jewish population, as I say, is just under 1,000 people. More than 1,000 young Muslim men arrive in Malmo now every day. Who thinks that
works out well, yeah.
is a good idea? I mean, this is the thing, Sam, I cannot understand. And I don't mind whatever vilification comes my way. I'll keep on saying this. I do not understand it. Every major mainstream European leader, unlike the American president, has said in recent years that the problem we face is of Islamist extremism. They've all said it. Hollande says it. Sarkozy said it. Merkel, Cameron, Blair, Brown, everyone says it. It's perfectly mainstream. And they recognize that it comes from a proportion, however small,
Mm.
of the Muslim populations in your countries. The question I cannot get an answer to is, at a time when every mainstream politician admitted that that was the case, why would you allow in an unprecedented number of Muslims into your society? What's your plan? What was
Mm.
the plan to change it? What was the plan to make multiculturalism work at this stage?
Yeah.
There was no plan.
Well, that's so.
It's
So
it
there's
is
literally there. So let's just linger on that claim. W- You're telling me there is no process of vetting these people. I mean, I can't imagine what it is when you're talking about a crowd, lingering
yeah.
on the border of razor wire that's been set up at the last minute, in Hungary. But what is the process of vetting, however ineffectual? The people just give their names and you put them on into some database and then hope to find out later whether or not they were Islamists?
A lot claim to be from places they're not, and there is a market in Syrian and other passports because they know that that's better to claim to be a Syrian. There are a lot of people who pretend to be children because they go through an easier process and so on. People clearly in their 20s and so on pretending to be children. And there are reception centers which effectively try to move people up and out of the point of entry on the Italian islands, on the Greek islands, and move them up as soon as possible into the rest of Europe so that there isn't the crowding that happened several years ago in some of these places. But no, an adequate system to work out who is who has not gone on. And what is more, once people do get in, they are in.
Right.
Nobody gets sent back. Nobody.
Just to spare us, if possible, charges of bigotry, given the short attention span of many people. Though you started this segment saying that you feel for these people, have nothing against these people, etc., etc. Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. I've said before that if we could vet these people meaning the migrants coming from
Mm.
all of these regions, in my view, the truly secular, truly liberal, liberal in the sense of wanting human rights and being
Hmm.
tolerant of diversity, people coming from the Muslim world, these are the most important people in the world to support, in my view. I mean, I think these people should be made immediate U.S. citizens if they wanted. I mean, the only problem there is that we're now
Mm.
pillaging the Muslim world of all of its intellectuals and all of the people it needs to establish some semblance of order there. So there's nothing that you have said just now, and nothing that I would ever say, is an expression of discomfort with brown-skinned people coming from North Africa or the Levant or anywhere else
Nope.
coming to the U.S. or Europe. We're talking about the consequences of beliefs. And the
Yeah.
problem here is it's very difficult to vet people's beliefs. It's very difficult to find out whether the person who just stumbled out of a raft on Lesbos is someone who thinks that dying in defense of the one true faith is the best thing that could possibly happen to him,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And if you just
And what's
ask
more,
him, it's not necessarily a penetrating enough question to get a candid answer on.
go a level beneath that. Never mind the case you just cite, which is obviously the hardest and the most felt right now. Go a level beneath that. Go to just a simple cultural free speech change. I was speaking in Denmark a few weeks ago
Mm.
at the Parliament in Copenhagen for the 10th anniversary of the publication of the Danish cartoons. And I spoke to a politician whilst I was there who said they didn't want any more Muslims arriving in Denmark. And they didn't want any refugees. They didn't want anyone from Syria who was a Muslim. And I said, but isn't that a problem? And so on. Mightn't there be some among them? Blah 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 blah. And this politician said, look, if we take in 10,000 people, for every 10,000 people, there will be, let's say, 7,000, 5,000, 4,000, 2,000, whatever number you want to plug, who don't believe we should have the right to publish what we think and to publish cartoons. So we don't want them. And if you look at, as I say, never mind the violence question, look at a poll that the BBC commissioned after the Charlie Hebdo murders in January. 27% of British Muslims said that they had sympathy with the motives of the Charlie Hebdo killers. Another 10% said they weren't sure or wouldn't say. Of course, the BBC spun this and said it's a great news. Majority of British Muslims support or against murdering cartoonists. But the point is, if you take in another 100 Muslims into a country, are you happy that on those kind of ratios, at least 27% are going to have some sympathy with people who want to do that? And actually, if they're coming from the Middle East or from North Africa, it's likely to be a lot higher. These are the questions that our societies need to ask, and which, because of the people you've cited earlier, among others, and many others we could speak, we have not been able to have this discussion. And it may be very late in the day to start having it, I have to say.
That's my main concern, that because it is so late in the day, it's obviously late in the day, we are facing a kind of emergency. And it's very, every generation succumbs to the distortion of looking through the lens of their present concerns and imagining that civilization hangs in the balance in a way that it hasn't in a very long time. But I really do feel that we are at a kind of turning point here on this issue, especially given how ineffectual and dishonest and disempowering the left has been. And I really worry that if we continue to see attacks of the sort we saw on Friday, or if we had an event in the U.S. that was larger than September 11th, which is absolutely plausible. In fact, from my point of view, it would be a miracle if we avoid such a thing perpetually. What does our political landscape look like after that? And I feel that, given a choice between Noam Chomsky and Ben Carson, right, in terms of the totality of their understanding of what's happening now in the world, I would vote for Ben Carson every time, right? Now, Ben Carson, I think, is a dangerously deluded religious imbecile, right? Ben Carson does not, the fact that he is even a candidate for the presidency of the United States is a scandal. But at the very least, I think he could be counted on to sort of get this right, which is to say he understands that jihadists are the enemies. And yet, we have the masochism on the left that is so totally disempowering in the face of this, and is just eager to destroy the reputation of anyone who will worry out loud about the dynamics of this problem, as you just did on the topic of migration. So I'm worried that the rise of the far right is now going to be another major story of our time. And
it'll be the only answer, Sam. It'll be the only answer in the end, and it'll be like that because of the left.
You didn't, frankly, have the balls to put country before party.